Hello and welcome. I am so glad that you have joined me today. Today we are looking at Nehemiah chapter 10, but we will be looking at a little bit of the tail end of chapter 9. So grab yourself a cuppa and we'll get started. So this chapter is about the agreement of the people. So going back to Nehemiah chapter 9, at the end of that chapter, verse 38, the people had come to a place of decision to commit themselves to God. And now, collectively, the whole nation is going to do something about it by entering into a covenant. So after listening to the law that had been read out and explained, and then obeying it, the Israelite leaders, so Nehemiah as the governor, the leaders of the people, and the Levites, they all signed a written covenant to God. This section from Nehemiah 10 to 27 just lists 84 names of the leaders who sealed that covenant, but the rest of the people, that is everyone else who had not knowledge and understanding, also made covenant with God, and they made this covenant publicly. And while this is a significant meaning was really between the individual and with God, it's also important that other people would be witnesses to that covenant. So the public covenant meant accountability and it meant mutual encouragement. So I'm not actually going to read all of this chapter because a large chunk of it is just sort of the list of names. So verses 1 to 27 is just names. And honestly, if I do read them out, I probably won't read them out, give the names justice. So we'll jump to verse 28. The rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the musicians, the temple servants, and all who separated themselves from their neighbouring peoples for the sake of the Lord, the law of God, together with their wives and all their sons and daughters who were able to understand. All these now join their fellow Israelites and nobles and bind themselves with a curse and an oath to follow the law of the God, given through Moses, the servant of God, to obey carefully the commands, the regulations, and the decrees of the Lord our God. So the first reference here, one of the references here, it talks about the temple servants. And so the Hebrew word here is Nethanim, not to be confused with the Nephilim in Genesis. So the Nethanim, which means that they're the temple slaves, they're the temple servants, they're assigned to the Levites and the priests for the service of the temple sanctuary. And the Nethanim did the menial work which was required of the temple operations, such as wood cutting or carrying water. Most translations of the Bible, they refer this group of people as temple servants, but other translations like the King James, they use that original Hebrew word, Nethinims. In verse 28, the people separated themselves from the neighbouring people for the sake of the Lord our God. And this separation was a conscious decision, and it was to avoid idolatrous practices of the other surrounding nations. And it was to maintain religious and spiritual purity as God's chosen people. And the intention was to honour God in their relationships. And it doesn't seem very politically correct, but we do need to consider who we frequently associate with and allow to speak into our lives, and to consider what type of people we allow to influence us morally and spiritually. So I want to make it clear, it does not mean that we cannot have deep, meaningful relationships with other non-believers. I'm not endorsing disassociating from anyone that doesn't agree with your religious points of view. I'm encouraging you to have healthy, God-honouring relationships with all people in our community, while establishing healthy boundaries to protect yourselves from the harm of others. So the Apostle Paul tells Timothy about friendships in 2 Timothy 3 verses 1 to 7, and he gives some stern advice in 2 Timothy 3 verses, specifically 3 verse 6 to 7. He says, jumping down there, actually from chapter 5, having a form of godliness but denying its power, have nothing to do with such people. So such people who have a form of godliness but are denying the power of the Spirit or the power of God or God's role in their life. They are the kind who worm their way into homes and gain control over gullible women who are loaded down with sins and are swayed by all kinds of evil desires, always learning but never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. So Paul teaches to have nothing to do with them because they're targeting vulnerable women. And these vulnerable women are being deceived and manipulated by these false teachers. So Paul highlights the need to establish these healthy boundaries, just like Nehemiah had, with the people to protect the vulnerable in our society. And Paul appears to reiterate this principle in Nehemiah. He says, where Nehemiah had said they were separating themselves from their neighbouring people. There's such a term about culling friends, and some common reasons you might want to sort of rethink the quality and the significance of those that are influential around you. You might want to consider things like, are such people bringing me temptation? Are they causing me to sin? Are they corrupting my character? Are they giving me stress more often than not? Does it distract me from my kingdom goals? Is it ruining other relationships? Has it broken trust so many times and they are unable to be faithful in the future? Do they tolerate your negative behaviour and don't encourage you to become more Christ-like? And are they influencing you away from God? And these are the things that you might want to consider when placing healthy boundaries on your relationships. Verse 30, we promise not to give our daughters in marriage to people around us or to take their daughters for our sons. So in Nehemiah 10 verse 30, the returned exiles had pledged not to intermarry with the inhabitants of the surrounding nations, primarily to preserve their covenantal identity and maintain purity of worship and prevent the return of idolatry back to those things that originally had caused the exile in the first place. Nehemiah uses the word "we promise." So this promise to stop intermarrying with the people of the land was extremely serious. And it's not a casual promise, but a binding and spiritually significant covenant that meant to reverse that spiritual decline that had previously led to their Babylonian exile. But sadly, often our promises extend only to the point where fulfilling our word becomes inconvenient. But the Bible does speak of keeping an oath even when it hurts. So that's in Psalms 15 verse 4. He who keeps an oath even when it hurts does not change his mind. But we do need to be aware of the seriousness of a promise before we actually commit to that promise and asking ourselves, are we really willing to follow through? It's interesting to note that the promise was addressed to the parents. And this is because in that day it was the parents that made the marriage decisions, not the people or the couple getting married. So just a note, if this covenant was repeated today, it wouldn't be focused toward the parents. It would probably be focused toward the individuals who are getting married. So this principle, it preserved the principle of the followers of God should only marry other similarly committed followers of God. And so it's obviously by experience and observation that it's important to be careful and prayerfully choose your spouse. Verse 31, and when the neighbouring peoples were bringing merchandise and grain to sell on the Sabbath, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath or on any holy day. Every 7th year we will forgo working the land and we will cancel all debts. So the second area of this decision and this commitment speaks of being faithful to God when it comes to doing business. So under the Old Testament law, God said that no one should buy or sell anything on the Sabbath, and these citizens of Jerusalem had been breaking this law. Now they were going into covenant to obey what God's original law was. So the motivation for breaking the law was really quite clear. You could make more money by selling things on 7 days of the week than just on 6 days of the week. And this was a covenant that was not only made with money, but it was made that they were obedient to glorifying God and trusting that God will fulfill all their financial requirements. It also spoke a little bit about the 7th year, and that would have been the year of Jubilee. I haven't actually got anything in my notes about that, but you could look that up yourself. The year of Jubilee, isn't the 7th year. It was a sabbatical year on the 7th. The year of Jubilee was the 49th, 50th year. So you can look that up yourself and do a deep dive into that topic yourself. Verse 32, we assume the responsibility for carrying out the commands to give 1/3 of a shekel each year to the service of the house of God, for the bread set out on the table, for the regular grain offerings and the burnt offerings, the offerings for the Sabbath and the new moon, and the appointed festivals, and for the holy offerings, for the sin offerings, to take atonement for Israel, and all the duties of the house of God. We, the priests and the Levites and the people, have cast lots to determine when each of our families is to bring to the house of the God at set times of the year a contribution of wood to burn at the altar of our God, as it is written by the law. So this third area of decision was about being faithful to God when it comes to supporting God's work. Particularly in this case, it was the temple work. And so they laid down a yearly tax to support the workings of the temple and provide food and provisions for the priests of the temple. And they required people to bring the wood to the temple so they could have their burnt sacrifices. And if we hold on to money so tightly that we will not be a giver, then it's revealed where our heart is when it comes to money. We love money more than generosity, if that's what we're doing. So we need to grasp loosely. In the New Testament, it speaks of with great clarity on the principle of giving. And giving should be regular, it should be planned, it should be proportional, and it really should be private. But it also must be sort of generous and freely given and cheerful. In 2 Corinthians 9 verses 6 to 8, it talks about sowing generously. It says that each person should give what is decided in your own heart to give, not to give reluctantly and not to give under compulsion, but because God loves a cheerful giver. Verse 35, we also assume responsibility for bringing to the house of the Lord each year the first fruits of our crops and of every fruit tree. So the first fruits was a Jewish feast held every sort of spring at the beginning of the grain harvest. It was observed on the 3rd day after Passover, the 2nd day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The first fruits was a time of thanksgiving to God, thanking him for his provision. In Leviticus, it institutes the first fruits offering in chapter 23. And the people were to bring a sheaf of grain to the priest, who would wave it before the Lord. And that was called a wave offering. A burnt offering or a meal offering and a drink offering were also required at these times. And so Jesus Christ, through his resurrection, is referred to the first fruits from the dead. We can see that in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 20 to 23. Verse 36, it was also written in the law that we would bring the firstborn of our sons, of our cattle, and the herds of our flock to the house of God. So the priests, to the priests ministering there. So the firstborn, sort of both human and animal, were considered holy to the Lord, signifying that everything, including family and your livelihood, everything belongs to God. And the firstborn and the first fruits were risky in the way of giving, because your land might not yield as much more. And your cow or your ewe might not give birth again. And yet the first fruits still belonged to God, and it was given to the priest. God promised to bless this giving of the first fruits and the firstborn in faith. Proverbs 3 verses 9 to 10 says, "Honour the Lord with all your possessions and with the first fruits of your increase, so that your barns will be filled with plenty and your vats will overflow with new wine." And so while the firstborn animals were sacrificed, firstborn sons were brought to the temple to be redeemed. So that meant to be bought back. So they're not sacrificed, it's okay. So they're bought back through payment, acknowledging that they were set apart for God, but spared the actual sacrifice. Because God didn't ever allow human sacrifice. The act was symbolising, acknowledging God's ownership of their families and remembering that the sparing of Israel's firstborn during the Passover in Egypt. Verse 37, "Moreover, we will bring to the storehouse of our God to the priests, and the first of our ground meal, our ground grain, the first fruits of our tree, and a new wine. And we'll bring all the tithes of our crops to the Levites, for it is the Levites who collect the tithes in all the towns where where we work. A priest descendant from Aaron is to accompany the Levites when they receive these tithes, and the Levites are to bring a tenth of these tithes, which is a tenth of the tenth, up to the house of God, to the storehouse of the treasury. And the people of Israel, including the Levites, are to bring their contributions of grain and new wine and olive oil to the storehouse, and where the articles of the sanctuary for the ministering priests and the gatekeepers and the musicians are also kept. We will not neglect the house of God. So this passage talks about tithing. And so Israelites pledged to support the temple by tithing agricultural products like grain and wine and oil to the Levites, who then brought a tenth of that into the storehouse. And so it's established a structured system of funding the temple service and those who served there as well, ensuring that the Levites themselves were not neglected. So the tithe is specifically mentioned in the books of Leviticus, Numbers and Deuteronomy. And the mandatory tithe is distributed locally to support the Levites and to assist the poor. So in Nehemiah 39b, it says, "We will not neglect the temple of God." And so we might reword this for relevance today to read something like, "We will not neglect the church buildings, its administrative functions and our pastoral support." So we give money to support the physical building that we're in and the administrative functions, and to also pay our pastor because they work very hard. We might reword it for relevance today to read something like, "We will not neglect the church as the body of believers," so the people. So we will invest in them, we will care for them, we will give financially where there is a need. We might reword this sentence in light of 1 Corinthians 3:16-17 and 1 Corinthians 6 verse 19-20, where it talks about our body being the temple of God. So we might reword this maybe as a bit of a stretch, that we will not neglect our physical bodies. But yes, the original text in Nehemiah 10 verse 39 says, "We will not neglect the temple of God." We will look after and be good stewards of what God has given us. So for personal application for this passage, you might want to consider what areas of your life you need to recommit and what you need to rededicate to God. And if you're serious about this dedication, just a thought that you might want to write a covenant with God detailing maybe some specific actions and including accountability, and maybe sharing it with a friend or something to help you commit to that accountability and that new desire to follow God and commit your life to God. And that's all I have for you from Nehemiah chapter 10. Again, it's always been a pleasure, and I look forward to seeing you next time when we are looking at Nehemiah chapter 11. Bye.